On another occasion, Delakiai actually had himself photographed with members of an anti-ETA death squad after a raid in which 2 pro-ETA demonstrators were killed. This, however, was unusual. In general, he preferred to stay in the background. Delakiai was an organizer, not a hitman. The gangs used for his raids were referred to by Delakiai himself as Comandos de Acción. To those who watched their activities and wondered just who they answered to, they were known as los incontrolados, the uncontrolled ones. But their operations were not simply freelance. In Spain, Delakiai was recruited to carry them out by the Spanish police through their secret service agency, the Brigada Central de Información. He reported regularly to the Brigada's headquarters in Madrid, and he was supplied with a favored Spanish police weapon, the Ingram machine gun. This weapon, manufactured in America and purchased in bulk by the Spanish police, provides the hardest evidence against Delakiai of his involvement at this time in terrorist activities. Not only was it a familiar part of the armory of his death squads, it was used in July 1976 to murder an Italian magistrate, Vittorio Accorsio, who had single-mindedly pursued investigations into Delakiai and his activities ever since the Piazza Fontana bombings in 1969. A couple of points to point out quickly. Again, the same Pierluigi Concutelli brought in to assassinate the Basque ETA leaders, the same man who shot Vittorio Accorsio. One more interesting and subtler point very interesting in light of what we're going to be talking about next week and things that are going on in the news these very same days these days, is that on one hand we have Stefano Delakiai, a man linked through Licio Gelli directly to Otto Skorzeny and right-wing coup attempts in Italy and right-wing pro-Nazi activities all over the globe, and of course Otto Skorzeny making his headquarters in the security establishment in Spain at this time, or just prior to this time. We have Stefano Delakiai attacking and assassinating Basque ETA members. At the same time, we have Muammar el-Gaddafi, who's also affiliated with Otto Skorzeny through the Paladin fascist group, part of the International Fascista. Muammar Gaddafi allegedly supporting the Basque ETA. This is very similar to situations that we have going on nowadays, where on one hand we have our American CIA agents involved with Gaddafi and helping him to train Middle Eastern terrorists, while at the same time we are using Gaddafi's support of these terrorists as an excuse for our other various activities in the Middle East. A very bizarre and yet subtle situation that we will be looking into more.
Okay, again, we'll be talking about that much more next week.
Continuing. Delakiai once told a television journalist that he had wept only once in his life, on the day in 1973 when he learned of his mother's death in Italy, and realized that he would be unable to attend her funeral. Quote, "Cursed be those who oblige me, after 3 years on the run, to be still far from my mother," he wrote in his diary. "I will find no peace until I have found my revenge. I shall find no peace until I have torn from their lurid faces the masks they wear of justice-makers of society." Unquote. The man he blamed for these limitations on my liberty, unquote, was the magistrate Accorsio, who was by now building up such a formidable case against him on charges of terrorism that Delakiai could not risk the trip to Italy. Sometime in the summer of 1975, therefore, he decided that Accorsio should die. He told members of Ordine Nuovo and Avanguardia Nazionale that Accorsio was a proven enemy of fascism. His death would be a political act which would remind the Italian people that the movement was still a force to be reckoned with. The man Delakiai chose to carry out the assassination was Luigi Concutelli, the Sicilian who had already taken part in ETA killings in Spain. Concutelli traveled to Italy in Easter 1976 carrying a large bag containing the disassembled parts of an Ingram machine gun, with the serial number filed off. At 8:30 a.m. on July 10th, as Accorsio brought his Fiat to a halt at the crossroads leading out of the Via Giuba in Rome, Concutelli approached the car on foot, holding the Ingram machine gun in front of him, and sprayed the windscreen with bullets. Accorsio made a desperate attempt to flee, but only managed to open the car door before collapsing. Concutelli walked calmly up and dropped several leaflets on the body. Each one bore a double-headed axe, the insignia of Ordine Nuovo. Concutelli was not picked up until January 1977, but when he was, police found the Ingram machine gun in his Rome flat. Despite the absence of the serial number, ballistics experts managed to trace the weapon back to its factory in Marietta, Georgia, from where it had been shipped in a batch sold to Spanish police before being passed on to Dela Chi. When asked how a weapon of theirs had gotten into the hands of a known terrorist, the Spanish police preferred not to comment. Dela Chi himself, when confronted by the evidence in the course of an interview, denied it. Quote, "I never gave the machine gun to Concutelli," he said, "nor did I give the order to murder Accorcio. However, I do approve of it, and don't condemn it." Unquote. By the time of the murder, he was approaching the end of his sojourn in Europe. The political stage on which he had operated all these years was beginning to shrink alarmingly. Portugal's director, Salazar, was dead. In Greece, the right-wing colonels had gone, and in November 1975, after a long and lingering illness, the caudillo of Spain, General Franco, finally died, bringing an end to a dictatorship that had lasted for 36 years. It was plain to Dela Chi that he would soon have to move on, and there was no doubt in his mind that the place he would be heading for was South America. His links there were already strong. Among his friends in Spain, he had numbered José López Rega, an Argentinian ex-police corporal who had been secretary to Argentina's charismatic leader Juan Perón during Perón's exile in Madrid. López Rega had returned with the dictator to Argentina in 1972, and there he had founded the right-wing death squads of the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance. López Rega, nicknamed El Brujo, the sorcerer, had held long discussions with Dela Chi before going to Argentina. Then, when Perón died and López Rega returned to Spain, he brought several AAA members with him. They swiftly found employment operating alongside Dela Chi's own squads of anti-ETA killers.
So basically, as the merry-go-round begins to turn here, Dela Chi and the same terrorist death squad P2-linked activity move to Spain and take up root in Spain. And we're going to be taking a look at the international movements of Dela Chi as he crosses the Atlantic here in just a second. It's worth noting that one of the people he crossed the Atlantic with was the aforementioned José López Rega, who, as we're going to see a little later, was one of the key members of the Argentinian branch of the P2, also a key member of the Internacional Fascista, as we're going to look at next week. So, from Italy, we move to Monte Carlo, from Monte Carlo to Spain, and it's worth noting also, and also to Greece. It's worth noting also, when the same as the spreading tentacles of the P2 reach out, that among the places in Europe affected by P2-related events was Poland, and this is going to figure very prominently later in our series as we get into the shooting attempt on Pope John Paul II and politics related to the trade union movement Solidarity in Poland. Returning now to In God's Name by David Yallop, about some of the, before returning to In God's Name, let me preface it by saying that among the reasons, as Nip hinted at, or touched on, I should say, earlier, among the reasons why Roberto Calvi's coffers wound up being so very empty was that he was channeling a great deal of money to a lot of different reactionary causes at the behest of Licio Gelli. One of the sources funded by the P2-related finances and also Vatican finances was the Solidarity movement in Poland. David Yallop writes of that in God's Name as follows. The Italian Christian Democrats, Communists, and Socialists were not the only political groups to receive money from Calvi. At Gelli's instructions, millions were given to the military regimes that then controlled Argentina and still control Uruguay and Paraguay. Money stolen by Calvi was used by the Argentinian military junta to purchase Exocet missiles from the French. Calvi's bank in Peru assisted in that deal. Millions went secretly and illegally to aid Solidarity in Poland. This particular transaction was a mix of money that Calvi had stolen and Vatican Bank funds collected from the Catholic faithful. Calvi often talked about these transactions to trusted friends. They included Carboni, that's Flavio Carboni, who, like all good Masons, was secretly running a tape recorder. Quote, Marcinkus must watch out for Casaroli, who is head of the group that opposes him. If Casaroli should meet one of those financiers in New York who are working for Marcinkus, sending money to Solidarity, the Vatican would collapse. Or even if Casaroli should find just one of those pieces of paper that I know of, goodbye Marcinkus, goodbye Watola, goodbye Solidarity. The last operation would be enough, the one for $20 million. I've also told Andreotti, but it's not clear which side he is on. If things in Italy go a certain way, the Vatican will have to hire a building in Washington behind the Pentagon, a far cry from St. Peter's. The total amount that was secretly and illegally funneled on behalf of the Vatican to Solidarity was over $100 million. So Solidarity funded by the same P2 complex to the tune of $100 million. The merry-go-round continues to turn. And with our next turn of the merry-go-round, we're going to jump the Atlantic.
Indeed, and we're going to go to that country renowned in song and story, Argentina. And we're going to be reading here from The Calvi Affair by Larry Gerwin. And the book is published in 1983 by Pan Books in association with Macmillan London. And Gerwin writes as follows. Although Jelly boasted of friendships with businessmen and right-wing political leaders throughout Latin America, his strongest connections were in Argentina, a country closely linked to Italy. It has been estimated that up to half of Argentina's population, of 30 million, is of Italian origin, and Italy has long ranked as one of Argentina's leading foreign investors and trading partners. With a few strategically placed friends in both Italy and Argentina, Jelly could make a fortune as a middleman. Jelly's penetration of the Argentine power structure came from his friendship with Juan Domingo Perón, the dictator with Juan Domingo Perón, the dictator who had been deposed in 1955. He first met Perón in 1971 when Perón was in exile in Spain and was fighting to make a comeback. The P2 leader took part in this campaign, and when Perón returned to Buenos Aires in 1973, Jelly was guest of honor at Perón's inauguration as president. Jelly was a guest of honor at Perón's inauguration as president. Giulio Andreotti, the former Italian prime minister who represented Italy at the ceremony, said later that he was struck by Perón's almost reverential regard for Jelly, adding, quote, I saw Perón kneel in front of Jelly. Soon after the inauguration, Jelly was able to add a number of important figures in Argentine society to his P2 membership list. These included José López Rega, Minister of Social Welfare and widely regarded as the power behind the throne. He was nicknamed El Brujo, the magician, because of his fascination with sorcery and the occult. López Rega was also the organizer of the AAA, the Alianza Anticomunista Argentina, a death squad later blamed for hundreds of, quote, disappearances. Admiral Emilio Macera was head of the Navy and also implicated in the death squads. A British journalist with long experience in South America describes Macera as, quote, a man of extreme ruthlessness, willing to use the most repulsive torture techniques against his opponents. A man totally without scruples. One of the few deeply evil men I have ever met, unquote. General Carlos Suarez Mason, or Mason, a military hardliner, was connected with López Rega's AAA, and later president of Yacimientos Petrolíferos Fiscales, YPF, Argentina's state-owned oil company. Petrolíferos Fiscales, there we go, Argentine state-owned oil company. José Bar Gelbard was Minister of the Economy and a business and political partner of López Rega. Not long after his inauguration, Perón made Jelly an Argentine diplomat, appointing him a special economic counselor in the Argentine embassy in Rome. In 1974, Perón died, and was succeeded on July 1st by his vice president and widow, Isabelita, though it was clear to everyone that José López Rega was making most of the decisions. In December of that year, Jelly and López Rega flew to Libya with a large retinue of Argentine functionaries to discuss trade between the two countries. From those discussions, a major trilateral deal resulted, involving Argentina, Libya, and Italy. Argentina would obtain arms from Italy and oil from Libya. In exchange, it would ship meat and Argentine-made Fiat products. It was later alleged that Argentina paid far above the market price for oil, with López Rega pocketing the difference. And I might just insert parenthetically that that's the same scam that Sindona and Calvi were running on behalf of Vatican Incorporated. In June 1975, Argentina military leaders forced Isabelita to dismiss López Rega, and El Brujo fled the country. In March 1976, Isabelita Perón herself was overthrown by a military junta. But Jelly easily survived the coup, since one of the members of the three-man junta was his old friend, Admiral Macera, the chief of the Navy. Not only did the P2 leader survive the coup d'etat, he prospered from it. The new rulers of the country soon decided to spend billions of dollars importing arms, and one big supplier was Italy. Together with Admiral Macera, Jelly went into the arms business. In 1976, the year of the coup, Gelli assisted in an Argentine purchase of 6 frigates from an Italian manufacturer, the state-owned Cantieri Navali Riuniti. Okay,
well, basically, well, first of all, let me say, broadcasting from Foothill College, this is KFJC Los Altos Hills, and beyond that, and we've now jumped the Atlantic. We're now dealing with the P2, with Licio Gelli, and with dyed-in-the-wool fascists, with death squads, with torture, with terrorism. The exact same thing that we saw in Italy and other places in Europe, only now we're in South America, rather. One of the key names to note here is Admiral Emilio Macera, who subsequently, by the way, was convicted of his torture of running the Escuela, the Navy school, which was a notorious torture center during the so-called Dirty War in Argentina, during which more than 30,000 people were killed. Note also here, for the purposes of discussion next week, the Libyan arms shipments, which supposedly went to Argentina. We're going to come back to that with a vengeance next week as well. But Macera, one of the key leaders of the Argentinian P2, and also, of course, an associate of Jose Lopez Rega and Stefano Della Chiai. So, again, note that P2 is moving across the Atlantic, and it moved across the Atlantic. We're following its movements across the Atlantic, and the establishment of P2 branches in many Latin American countries. In Banks We Trust, Penny Lernoux develops the Argentinian P2 connection still further, and indicates that perhaps Licio Gelli himself may have been involved in the dirty war in Argentina, as he undoubtedly was in Italy. Reading now from In Banks We Trust. When later confronted with evidence of his membership in the P2, Admiral Macera claimed that Gelli's work on behalf of the junta had been, quote, of undeniable merit in the fight against subversion, unquote, and that he had collaborated actively to spread the truth of our war against terrorism in Europe, unquote. But the eulogy took on a sinister note when it was learned that a naval intelligence operation Macera had been directing with Gelli in Paris was linked to several murders, including those of 2 Argentine diplomats. Macera was also linked to the 1977 disappearance of the Argentine ambassador to Venezuela, Hector Hidalgo Solá. According to court testimony, Gelli and Macera wanted an ambassador who would do their bidding in the petroleum-rich nation, but Hidalgo Solá, S-O-L-A, refused either to cooperate or to give up his post. He was replaced by a diplomat who was a member of the P2. Though Argentina was the P2's headquarters in Latin America, it also had important lodges in Uruguay, Paraguay, and Brazil. In Montevideo, Gelli's associate Count Ortolani built up a membership of at least 500, including prominent military hardliners. Using the diplomatic cover of Ambassador of the Order of Malta, we're going to talk about the Knights of Malta at great length in our last broadcast, he, that is Ortolani, also acquired large real estate holdings in association with Gelli. After the P2 scandal broke in Europe, Gelli fled to Montevideo, where he hired a private plane to fly him to a ranch he owned in southern Brazil. Ortolani sought refuge in São Paulo, Brazil. The Uruguayan military obligingly waited until he left the country to act on an Interpol request for a search of his house. But Uruguayan authorities refused to release the papers found there, presumably because they contained incriminating evidence against military officials. By the way, we're going to take a look at one of the people who apparently got a hold of some of those Uruguayan papers later in the broadcast, a man named Michael Ledeen, one of the key players on our stage as we proceed through this series. But note now, Argentine P2 is the headquarters of the P2 in Latin America, but it has branches in many different countries, particularly Uruguay, Paraguay, and Brazil. And note the possible role of Licio Gelli in the very dirty war in which not only has Emilio Macera been convicted, but Jose Lopez Rega is currently arrested in the United States and awaiting extradition to Argentina.
And, of course, also, as we'll see in just a few articles, the the P2 influence also winds up spreading to Nicaragua, a country very much in the news these days. But first we're going to see how another P2 member's influence, banking and financial influence, spread into Latin America. And that, of course, is Roberto Calvi. Talking about Calvi, there we go, okay, from the Calvi affair, as we read about earlier, says Calvi's third Latin American bank was opened in Argentina in 1980. Bearing the grand name Banco Ambrosiano de América del Sur, it had impressive headquarters in Buenos Aires. Just as Banco Andino had been touted in the press as an important new multinational bank, Calvi's Argentine bank was said to be a significant contribution to Latin American development. This time, however, the hand of Licio Gelli could be clearly discerned behind the favorable publicity. For the most fawning coverage was in newspapers belonging to the Abril Group, an Argentine publishing company recently purchased, with Gelli's assistance, by Rizzoli. Unlike Calvi's first two Latin American banks, which had offshore status, the Argentine bank was licensed to do business locally. Gelli evidently hoped to use the new bank to exploit his local contacts. In fact, one of Gelli's prime Argentine contacts, Admiral Massera, took an office in the same building as the new bank after his resignation from the ruling junta.
And, okay, now basically, remember Admiral Massera and his connections with Roberto Calvi as well as Licio Gelli, because Admiral Massera and his torture center, the Escuela, apparently played a key role in helping Licio Gelli to escape. Following research credit for the following story goes to Ted Rubenstein. He got this from the London Sunday Times of September 9th, 1984.
You will also remember, of course, that we talked about that escape from a Swiss jail and how very much like Michele Sindona's attempt earlier on, it was a faked kidnapping of sorts, and that the first allegations by Licio Gelli's lawyer was that it was in fact a kidnapping. The Argentine Navy played a key role in helping Licio Gelli, the fugitive Grand Master of the Italian Masonic Lodge P2, escape from a Swiss jail last August, according to evidence which emerged last week. Italian magistrates are planning to fly to Buenos Aires to question a man who claims to have forged 5 passports for Gelli on the orders of the Navy, then part of Argentina's military dictatorship in a secret concentration camp. The witness, Victor Melchor Bastera, is one of the rare survivors of the Argentine Navy's mechanical school in Buenos Aires, a naval college which contained a notorious clandestine prison and torture center during the Dirty War in the late 70s. Bastera, who was a left-wing Peronist, was kidnapped by Navy death squads in August 1979 and, like thousands of others, disappeared. But Bastera, perhaps because of his skills as a graphic artist and his willingness to collaborate, survived. Last week he told his story to the Sunday Times. Quote, "After a painful confession, I became one of a group of subversives who had been recuperated for society." Unquote, he said. "They didn't release me but put me to work in the documentation section, which served what they called the task groups. I filled in false identity cards, driving licenses, and passports." Bastera remained a prisoner until last December. It was in 1982, while Gelli was in prison in Switzerland, that Bastera's Navy jailers ordered him to forge 5 passports, each with different names, and each carrying a photograph which Bastera recognized from newspapers as that of Gelli. Quote, "Nobody explained why," he said. "It was just one of many jobs they gave me." After escaping from his Swiss jail cell in August last year, Gelli disappeared, but is believed to be in hiding in South America. Bastera, who has gone into hiding for fear of reprisals, supported his testimony with documentary and corroborative evidence from his time inside the Navy school. After 1981, he says he was sufficiently trusted by the Navy to be given an identity card which permitted him to enter and leave the building, although on condition that he return at night. During this period, he smuggled out of the building photographs he had copied of other prisoners and documentary evidence against officers involved in torture and murder. Bastera's testimony is the most concrete evidence of a long-suspected link between Gelli and the Argentine Navy, whose chief at the time of the Dirty War, Admiral Emilio Massera, is one of the many prominent Argentines who figure on the membership list of the P2 Lodge. Skipping down, Admiral Massera, who enjoyed a luxurious suite of offices in the Banco Ambrosiano building in Buenos Aires, was notorious as one of Argentina's most ruthless advocates of the policy of eliminating suspected subversives. He is now serving time in a military prison, accused of causing the disappearance of the husband of his mistress. So confident was Gelli of his P2 protection that he openly visited Massera in prison earlier this year.
So Massera not only apparently at least living in the same building, has offices in the same building as Roberto Calvi's Argentine Banco Nuevo Ambrosiano, but also apparently through his skills as a torturer able to coerce concrete help for Licio Gelli's escape from Switzerland. And the emphasis here, once again, is on the international character of these machinations. One of the other places where the P2 touched down in Latin America was Nicaragua, as the next two sections we're going to read you, next two articles or excerpts we're going to read you will indicate. Returning once again to the Calvi affair by Larry Gerwin. Around the same time, Calvi paid several visits to Nicaragua, where he met with President Anastasio Somoza. Somoza was regarded as one of the most corrupt dictators in Latin America, having pocketed millions of dollars in international aid intended to help the country recover from the devastating 1972 earthquake. What is more, Somoza was facing increasing opposition, soon to explode into civil war, from the Sandinista guerrillas. In spite of Nicaragua's drawbacks, Calvi applied for permission to open a banking subsidiary in the country, and Somoza readily agreed. The new bank would have the status of an offshore bank, meaning that it was limited in the amount of domestic business it could do. It opened on September 29, 1977, with the name Ambrosiano Group Banco Comercial, and once again, yet another country touched by the P2 nexus, this time Nicaragua, and apparently that wasn't the only thing that Calvi was doing there as well.
Okay, again, reading from one of Jonathan Marshall's translations from the Italian, provided to us by Ted Rubenstein. This is from L'Espresso, the daily newspaper of October 9th, 1983. The Vatican paid billions of lira to Somoza. This is a new chapter in the secret affairs of IOR. That, by the way, is the Institute for Religious Works, the Vatican Bank. The judge investigating the Calvi-Ambrosiano case is looking into it. Flavio Carboni, the confidant of Roberto Calvi, revealed it. After referring to the finances of IOR that ended up in the coffers of Solidarity, again, that is not Solidarity, the Polish resistance group, that is a right-wing group by the name of Solidarity.
Well, actually,
I'm sorry, you're right.
It is the Polish...
you're right, you're absolutely right.
You may be right on both counts, but it's the Polish Solidarity, and it's worth emphasizing that point here, because we're going to be coming back to the Polish Solidarity in our later broadcasts in a big way.
That's right. No, I was thinking of the Galen, Galen-affiliated Solidarists,
yeah.
Right.
Well, there may be a connection
there. There may very well. Now, we're going to be talking about Lech Wałęsa and Luigi Scricciolo and others later on. Okay, going back again. We're talking now about the Vatican Bank paying billions of lira to Somoza. After referring to the finances of IOR, again the Vatican Bank, that ended up in the coffers of Solidarity, and as Dave mentioned, that is in fact the same Solidarity that Lech Wałęsa was the head of. Carboni added new particulars. To Judge Ferdinando Imposimato, the builder said that, according to Roberto Calvi, Marcinkus, again Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, head of the Vatican Bank, lavished tens of billions of lira on Anastasio Somoza. And that's not all. Again, according to Calvi, as told by Carboni, Marcinkus' experts participated in the drawing up of the Nicaraguan Constitution promulgated by Somoza. Paul VI wasn't aware of all this. Calvi threatened to make this and other affairs public if the Vatican Bank didn't come through with the letter of patronage to cover the debts of Ambrosiano. Calvi was well acquainted with Somoza's affairs. From Somoza, Calvi got a diplomatic passport and was accredited to the Geneva seat of the UN. Those familiar with the facts say that Somoza's loyalty to Calvi and Marcinkus was unlimited. Not only the Constitution, but the laws covering banks in Nicaragua were prepared in Italy in a Milan office of Ambrosiano. Okay, now this is an interesting connection for a variety of reasons. Now, first of all, we have this direct allegation by a former intimate of Roberto Calvi that Paul Marcinkus, on behalf of the Vatican Bank, gave tens of billions of lira, to Anastasio Somoza, the dictator of Nicaragua, and more than that, that Marcinkus' experts participated in the drawing up of the Nicaraguan Constitution. Okay? Now, another interesting thing here is that we have Marcinkus' experts working on these Nicaraguan laws, including the banking laws and the Constitution, preparing them in the Milan office of Ambrosiano. Well, as we have talked about in past broadcasts on this station, but we haven't talked about yet in this series, linked with the Milan office of Roberto Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano, the main office, was also STIBOM, the huge guns for drugs terrorism network that we're going to be talking about in future broadcasts. So it's interesting to think of Paul Marcinkus' personal envoys sitting there in the Milan offices, which are basically seem to be linked to and connected to STIBOM itself, the organization that seems to be directly in the chain of movement of the gun and the murderer, or the would-be murderer, directly into the path of John Paul II. And we have Marcinkus' men working with this milieu to draft a Nicaraguan constitution for Anastasio Somoza.
The paymaster for the alleged plot against the Pope was in fact, the man who supposedly was the paymaster was in fact one of the key principles with regard to STIBOM. And it's interesting in light of the Somoza connection to IOR and to Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano that one of the things which has been reported about STIBOM is that according to a very conservative source, this one, Reader's Digest, it may even have been used by the Central Intelligence Agency to obtain Soviet Kalashnikov rifles for the Contras in Nicaragua. We'll be talking about that next week.
Indeed, and while we're on the subject of all of these things, and we're talking about hands across the ocean and fascism across the waves, Dave and I are going to go across the room and take a slight break. But we're going to leave you with some music while we're gone, so nobody panic. And when we return, we will have more of the various machinations of the P2 and the various Undercover of the Night by the Rolling Stones from their Undercover album, and Washington Bullets by the Clash from their Sandinista album. Two rather appropriate songs. Under the circumstances, and the circumstances that we are under is our discussion of the expansion to South America of the entire organization, the seed of the P2 Fascist Lodge of Italy, the Propaganda Due Masonic Lodge, in the person of people like Stefano Della Chiai, Licio Gelli, and Roberto Calvi, and their transshipment of their entire organization, both death squads, political action, and their entire financial network.
Now, one of the things that we've been looking at over the course of these three broadcasts is the active cooperation between not only the P2 Nexus, the Vatican, the P2 Lodge, Italian fascists, and Western intelligence, particularly U.S. intelligence. Now, one of the things that we're going to be looking at largely for the rest of this broadcast this evening, and that's going to figure very prominently in our final two broadcasts, where we actually get down to the actual shooting of Pope John Paul II, is to what extent the various operations of the P2 Vatican Ambrosiano axis that we've been looking at are being undertaken in conjunction with or at the behest of U.S. intelligence. So the U.S. intelligence connection with this whole nexus that we've been talking about and have been looking at since the Rat Line, where we have Fritz Schwend, we have Licio Gelli, we have Cardinal Montini, later Paul VI, and U.S. intelligence actively cooperating to get Nazis from Europe to Latin America, and we're looking at that same Vatican P2 U.S. intelligence Nazi nexus now operating in Central America, in South America, in Europe, and also in the United States today.
Okay. And Dave is going to explain now exactly and precisely the beginnings of some of the things that are going to expand and blossom in later weeks as we examine the Western contacts in depth.
Now, we're going to return once again to the book The Calvi Affair by Larry Gerwin. And here Gerwin is going to discuss the possibility that many of the Calvi and P2 machinations in Central America, I have to come up with operations, let's say, I've used the word machinations enough tonight, that many of the P2 Ambrosiano Vatican-related operations in Central America are not only operating for, but perhaps with U.S. interests and U.S. intelligence in particular. From The Calvi Affair by Larry Gerwin. The involvement of Banco Ambrosiano and perhaps even the Vatican Bank with Latin American regimes has been the subject of intense speculation. One theory is that Calvi and Gelli used Ambrosiano's network of banks and ghost companies to funnel money to right-wing regimes. After Calvi's death, Michele Sindona put forward this view on several occasions. Calvi, he said, was directly financing all the anti-communists of South America. He wanted to defend the world from communists, about which he had become paranoid like me. This scheme, he said, was conceived with Gelli and Ortolani. Sindona told a reporter for ABC television that the ghost companies bought newspapers, real estate, and companies in Argentina, Peru, Uruguay, and Paraguay. The purchases, he said, were made at inflated prices, and the excess money was paid to right-wing political parties and military leaders. Was the Vatican also involved? According to Sindona, the answer is yes. Sindona says that right-wing factions within the Vatican approved of the Latin American operations because to fight communism automatically means supporting Catholicism, unquote. An American banker with long experience in Central America takes this theory one step further. He believes strongly that elements in the Vatican were working in association with the CIA to funnel money to right-wing forces in Latin America. The belief that these elements work closely with U.S. intelligence officials is not new, and there seems to be considerable support for it. For example, Archbishop Marcinkus is a staunch anti-communist in the 1950s mold, who frequently uses expressions like the Iron Curtain countries, unquote. He has long been the most senior American citizen in the Vatican, and according to a U.S. diplomat, is therefore the main point of contact between the State Department and the Vatican. For instance, before papal tours, U.S. officials would arrange through Marcinkus to brief the Pope on the countries he was visiting. The Pope also reportedly received CIA briefings on events in Poland. One Latin America venture that seems to pull together many of these interests is a project to develop oil in Guatemala. In 1977, the concession was awarded by that country's military rulers to Basic Resources International S.A., BRISA, a Luxembourg company, one of whose board members has been Antonio Tonello, T-O-N-E-L-L-O, chairman of Calvi's Credito Vaticino, and a director of various other Ambrosiano subsidiaries. In May of 1981, General Vernon Walters, a retired CIA official, visited Guatemala as a goodwill ambassador of the Reagan administration. At the same time, though, he was representing BRISA, which was seeking permission to export more oil. The Guatemalan military granted the request. So, summing up very briefly what we've seen here in this passage, Michele Sindona is claiming nothing less than that the huge holes that appeared in Banco Ambrosiano were due to the fact that, at Licio Gelli's behest and in cooperation with the Vatican, and some also believe the CIA, that basically Banco Ambrosiano was being used to finance anti-communism in Latin America, and according to Sindona, was apparently one of the main sources of finance for it. And still more significantly, perhaps for our present purposes, one of the people who was apparently involved not only with diplomatic maneuvering, but also apparently was intersecting with the Calvi financial empire, or Calvi financial disaster, as it turned out to be, was none other than Vernon Walters. Vernon Walters was not only deputy director of the CIA during the CIA-supported coup against Salvador Allende, and we're going to take a look at P2 connections to the DINA secret police of Pinochet, but Vernon Walters also, in addition to being a right-wing Catholic himself, is now the United States ambassador to the United Nations.
Okay, and putting the whole thing in even more capsulized form is Penny Lernoux in her book In Banks We Trust. And she puts it this way: what had all this plotting to do with the Vatican Bank? The bank's two principal financial advisors and partners, Michele Sindona and Roberto Calvi, were members of P2, a neo-fascist Masonic lodge in Milan headed by the Italian fascist financier Licio Gelli, who had dropped from public sight. Gelli was wanted in Italy for, among other things, his connection with the Pagliai and Della Chiai bombing of the Bologna railway station. Other members of P2 who used Della Chiai's terrorist organization for equally sinister purposes included Lopez Rega and his son-in-law Raul Lastiri, the fascist Black Prince Borghese, General Vito Miceli, former head of a disbanded, scandal-ridden intelligence agency in Italy, and a representative in Parliament of the neo-fascist Italian Social Movement Party, MSI, founded by Borghese, and Admiral Emilio Macera, member of the Argentine military junta that overthrew Isabel Perón's government in 1976, and head of a torture center in Buenos Aires. As shown by Italian authorities, P2 was, quote, a state within the state, its aim being to restore fascism in Italy and buttress its hold on Latin America. Calvi's Ambrosiano Bank in Milan was employed to finance P2's political and financial interests in Latin America, and Della Chiai's Ordine Nuovo was P2's paramilitary arm. Okay, now one of the things that we've been talking about here as we branch over into the connections to Western intelligence is the fact that this huge organization did not go A, unnoticed, B, unhelped, or C, unutilized by Western intelligence. This organization, which along with the Vatican Bank had in common with the CIA anti-communism in all its forms and in all its usages, was probably the most important single Italian political organization, and perhaps the most important political organization in the Mediterranean, and certainly one of the comers in Latin America as well. And of course, Latin America has traditionally been regarded as by the United States as its backyard, and the importation of a rabidly anti-communist, pro-fascist, financially extremely well-funded, if not solidly managed, organization would be bound to interest the United States intelligence services.
Now, another of the Latin American countries profoundly affected by the P2 nexus was Chile. Now, the aforementioned Stefano Della Chiai, key participant with Licio Gelli and the P2 crowd in just about every key terrorist incident in Italy, went to work for the DINA. Returning again to In Banks We Trust by Penny Lernoux. Of the principals in the Santa Cruz network, and by the way, we're going to hook back up with Klaus Barbie, one of the a U.S. intelligence agent who used Gelli's rat line to escape to Latin America and worked with U.S. intelligence. Of the principals in the Santa Cruz network, that's Santa Cruz, Bolivia, Barbie was the most notorious, but Della Chiai was probably the more dangerous. Known in Latin American circles as the Black Pimpernel, the Italian terrorist had arrived in Bolivia on an Argentine passport and according to Bolivian press reports, now took refuge in Argentina along with Bolivia's Colonel Arce Gomez, who was given official sanctuary. Dela Quiai's Argentine contacts went back to the 1970s when the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, the AAA, a paramilitary death squad, was founded by José López Rega, chief hatchet man in the corrupt government of Isabel Perón, and also, of course, a key member of Argentine P2, as we just looked at. Like Pagliai and Dela Quiai, López Rega and his son-in-law Raúl Lastiri, who briefly served as Argentine president, were implicated in the Bolivian cocaine traffic, using the northern Argentine province of Salta for a three-nation cocaine operation involving Argentina, Bolivia, and Paraguay. Orlando Bosch, the notorious Cuban exile terrorist who also worked with the AAA, and he and Dela Quiai were associated with a death squad organized by the Chilean secret police after Salvador Allende's overthrow in 1973. Among that group's victims, by the way, Vernon Walter is a key person in that overthrow. Among that group's victims was Orlando Letelier, Allende's ambassador to Washington, who was blown to bits by a terrorist bomb on Washington's Embassy Row in 1976. Eugene M. Proper, the assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the case, discovered that the Chilean police's most enthusiastic Italian contact, unquote, was a person called Alpha, codename for Dela Quiai, who also was known as the Black Bomber, unquote. According to Proper, Dela Quiai set up the attempted assassination of former Chilean Vice President Bernardo Leighton and his wife in Rome in 1975. So Dela Quiai not only on the other side of the Atlantic now, but working with the DINA, the Chilean secret police, and in that capacity, he hooks up with Klaus Barbie.
Okay, now we're going to continue with a section from The Nazi Legacy by Magnus Linklater and Company, describing some of the further machinations of Pagliai and Dela Quiai. He and Pagliai began traveling to Europe in pursuit of their duties. They held Argentine passports and were paid by the Argentine military in dollars. Soon they were performing a similar service in Nicaragua and El Salvador, transmitting information back to Buenos Aires on left-wing exiles and passing on arms, equipment, and finally men for the Salvadorian death squads. That, of course, is El Salvador. Dela Quiai was an efficient recruiter of European labor. He telephoned his unemployed friends in France, Germany, Italy, and Spain and negotiated trial contracts which rarely paid less than $1,500 a month. Towards the end of 1979, Argentina's military leaders began to look anxiously at the deteriorating political situation across their northern border in Bolivia. Argentina was just emerging from its devastating internal dirty war, in which up to 30,000 people had, quote, disappeared, and the military leadership was deeply concerned about Bolivia's trend to the left, a trend which could easily cross the border and refuel resistance to the military in Argentina. An Argentine intelligence officer, Major Hugo Raúl Miore Pereira, whom Dela Quiai had got to know well during his time in Buenos Aires, in Central America, was appointed by the military high command in Buenos Aires to maintain close liaison with right-wing Bolivian officers. It was in Miore's fashionable apartment on the Avenue Libertador in Buenos Aires that Dela Quiai first came into contact with a series of prominent Bolivians, including General Hugo Banzer. As a result of those meetings in late 1979, Dela Quiai and Pagliai, traveling in the guise of the Argentine officers Moduño and Bonone, moved discreetly to Bolivia via Central America. They had come to offer their support in mounting the military coup, which Klaus Barbie and his friends were by now actively preparing. This is very similar to situations that we have going on nowadays, where on one hand we have our American CIA agents involved with Gaddafi and helping him to train Middle Eastern terrorists, while at the same time we are using Gaddafi's support of these terrorists as an excuse for our other various activities in the Middle East. A very bizarre and yet subtle situation that we will be looking into more.
Okay, again, we'll be talking about that much more next week.
Continuing. Dela Quiai once told a television journalist that he had wept only once in his life, on the day in 1973 when he learned of his mother's death in Italy, and realized that he would be unable to attend her funeral. Quote, "Cursed be those who oblige me, after 3 years on the run, to be still far from my mother," he wrote in his diary. "I will find no peace until I have found my revenge. I shall find no peace until I have torn from their lurid faces the masks they wear of justice-makers of society," unquote. The man he blamed for these limitations on my liberty, unquote, was the magistrate Accorcio, who was by now building up such a formidable case against him on charges of terrorism that Della Chiai could not risk the trip to Italy. Sometime in the summer of 1975, on another occasion, Della Chiai actually had himself photographed with members of an anti-ETA death squad after a raid in which 2 pro-ETA demonstrators were killed. This, however, was unusual. In general, he preferred to stay in the background. Della Chiai was an organizer, not a hitman. The gangs used for his raids were referred to by Della Chiai himself as Comandos de Acción. To those who watched their activities and wondered just who they answered to, they were known as los incontrolados, the uncontrolled ones. But their operations were not simply freelance. In Spain, Della Chiai was recruited to carry them out by the Spanish police through their secret service agency, the Brigada Central de Información. He reported regularly to the Brigada's headquarters in Madrid, and he was supplied with a favored Spanish police weapon, the Ingram machine gun. This weapon, manufactured in America and purchased in bulk by the Spanish police, provides the hardest evidence against Della Chiai of his involvement at this time in terrorist activities. Not only was it a familiar part of the armory of his death squads, it was used in July 1976 to murder an Italian magistrate, Vittorio Accorcio, who had single-mindedly pursued investigations into Della Chiai and his activities ever since the Piazza Fontana bombings in 1969. A couple of points to point out quickly. Again, the same Pierluigi Concutelli brought in to assassinate the Basque ETA leaders, the same man who shot Vittorio Accorcio. One more interesting and subtler point very interesting in light of what we're going to be talking about next week and things that are going on in the news these very same days these days, is that on one hand we have Stefano Della Chiai, a man linked through Licio Gelli directly to Otto Skorzeny and right-wing coup attempts in Italy and right-wing pro-Nazi activities all over the globe, and of course Otto Skorzeny making his headquarters in the security establishment in Spain at this time, or just prior to this time. We have Stefano Della Chiai attacking and assassinating Basque ETA members. At the same time, we have Muammar el-Gaddafi, who is also affiliated with Otto Skorzeny through the Paladin fascist group, part of the International Fascista. Muammar Gaddafi allegedly supporting the Basque ETA. Therefore, he decided that Accorcio should die. He told members of Ordine Nuovo and Avanguardia Nazionale that Accorcio was a proven enemy of fascism. His death would be a political act which would remind the Italian people that the movement was still a force to be reckoned with. The man Della Chiai chose to carry out the assassination was Luigi Concutelli, the Sicilian who had already taken part in ETA killings in Spain. Concutelli traveled to Italy in Easter 1976 carrying a large bag containing the disassembled parts of an Ingram machine gun, with the serial number filed off. At 8:30 a.m. on July 10th, as Accorcio brought his Fiat to a halt at the crossroads leading out of the Via Giuba in Rome, Concutelli approached the car on foot, holding the Ingram machine gun in front of him, and sprayed the windscreen with bullets. Accorcio made a desperate attempt to flee, but only managed to open the car door before collapsing. Concutelli walked calmly up and dropped several leaflets on the body. Each one bore a double-headed axe, the insignia of Ordine Nuovo. Concutelli was not picked up until January 1977, but when he was, police found the Ingram machine gun in his Rome flat. Despite the absence of the serial number, ballistics experts managed to trace the weapon back to its factory in Marietta, Georgia, from where it had been shipped in a batch sold to Spanish police before being passed on to Della Chiai. When asked how a weapon of theirs had gotten into the hands of a known terrorist, the Spanish police preferred not to comment. Della Chiai himself, when confronted by the evidence in the course of an interview, denied it. Quote, "I never gave the machine gun to Concutelli," he said, "nor did I give the order to murder Accorcio. However, I do approve of it, and don't condemn it." Unquote. By the time of the murder, he was approaching the end of his sojourn in Europe. The political stage on which he had operated all these years was beginning to shrink alarmingly. Portugal's director, Salazar, was dead. In Greece, the right-wing colonels had gone, and in November 1975, after a long and lingering illness, the caudillo of Spain, General Franco, finally died, bringing an end to a dictatorship that had lasted for 36 years. It was plain to Della Chiai that he would soon have to move on. and there was no doubt in his mind that the place he would be heading for was South America. His links there were already strong.